we've we've been looking at Jesus' interpretation of the law of Moses and seeing how he redeems the law by making it a matter of the heart. And in this study, we've seen how revolutionary Jesus actually is, how committed to social justice he is, and how from the religious establishment of his day to the religious establishment and secular and political establishments of the present day have often tried to soften these words from the mountaintop. Pinchas Lapide, the Jewish scholar, said, "The history of the impact of the Sermon on the Mount can largely be described in terms of an attempt to domesticate everything in it that is shocking, demanding, uncompromising, and render it harmless." See, just like the Pharisees misrepresented the law in order to justify their own misdeeds, so too many Christians have taken this radical message of Jesus and they've tried to turn it into something else. And as we come to this fifth antithesis, we see a shift from a discussion about purity to a discussion about justice. See, Jesus has run through anger, lust, and integrity, both in the marriage relationship and in general. These are the concepts of maintaining one's own holiness internally. But now he shifts to exposing the unholiness of others through the principles of nonviolence. And in doing this, Jesus revolutionizes the idea of biblical justice. See, instead of fighting for our rights, Jesus says, he suggests we lay them down. Instead of confronting the oppressor with the sword, he advocates a path of submission and a path of peace. Just as the pursuit of holiness is about internal and external doings, so too the pursuit of justice becomes about the inward conviction of the oppressor rather than outward consequence. In doing so, Jesus revolutionizes the idea of biblical justice. And instead of fighting for our rights, Jesus suggests that we lay them down. Instead of confronting the oppressor with the sword, Jesus advocates a path of submission. See, just as the pursuit of holiness was something about internally, something internal to you and not about external doings, so too the pursuit of justice then becomes about the inward conviction of the oppressor rather than the outward consequences. For Jesus, the goal is not to defeat the enemy, but to defect the enemy. There are no casualties in this war, only conversions. The enemy is defeated only when convicted and turned into an ally. The fifth and sixth antitheses deal with our treatment of an enemy and our pursuit of godly biblical justice. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. On the contrary, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. As for the one who wants to sue you and take away your shirt, let him have your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks you, and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, you know that Old Testament law of an eye for an eye. It sounds rough to us, but it was actually a very good law. The Romans had this law. They called it lex talionis, the law of retaliation. And this was a good law because it insisted that the punishment fit the crime. This wasn't meant to be some sort of vigilante justice or a he hit me so I hit him kind of scenario. This is 2 parties coming before a judge, one side offering evidence of wrongdoing, the other pleading innocence or attempting to justify themselves, and the judge rendering a decision. And in all, God is saying that the punishment must fit the crime. The punishment cannot exceed the harm that was done. And then, too, even though it says an eye for an eye, when we get into the nuances of it, that punishment did not have to be violent. The point of the law of retribution was that in the end, everything would be equitable. And the law of Moses then made it a vast improvement over other ancient law codes that were very harsh and very violent. And I dare say it's an improvement upon many of our legal codes today. The law for an eye wasn't meant to enact violence, it was meant to restrain violence. And instead of this, we've interpreted it, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in the days of Jesus have interpreted it, to make this into something that demands violence rather than something that speaks against it. The Pharisees took the law out of context. They tried to apply it to any personal situation. And they moved it from criminal law to personal offense. If someone slaps you, you slap them back. If someone sues you, you countersue. If your enemy, a Roman soldier, enlists you to carry his things, resist it the entire way. And they were trying to apply this law to their personal interactions and relationships. They were trying to take the law into their own hands. Instead of taking it as a limit on vengeance, they instead took it as a mandate for vengeance and personal retaliation. Now, apply this thinking nationally. Most of Israel would readily take up arms against Rome if they thought they could win. Just a few years prior, Pontius Pilate had murdered hundreds of rebelling Jews during Passover. And a few decades prior to that, an insurrection had led to thousands of crucifixions throughout Jerusalem. The political faction called the Zealots were actively seeking the violent overthrow of Rome. And all of the messianic expectations in the first century, all of the messianic expectations surrounding Jesus were one as a political revolutionary, as a warrior who would come and claim their kingdom by force. N.T. Wright puts it this way. He says, God's kingdom to the Jew in the village in the first half of the first century meant the coming vindication of Israel, victory over the pagans, the eventual gift of peace, justice, and prosperity. But Jesus, as he has now so often done, fundamentally reinterpreted his people's hope for a messianic kingdom. Instead of taking over, Jesus would work within. His triumphal entry into Jerusalem is not on the horse of war, but on the donkey of peace. And he goes and he cleanses not Herod's palace, but Herod's temple. And he rejects the violent revolutionaries of his day and goes so far as to say, you go with your enemy the second mile. If they conscript you to carry their bags for a mile, go a second. Because the kingdom comes not by military victory, but by the doubly revolutionary method of turning the other cheek. The old covenant taught an eye for an eye. The new covenant sees that as only the start. Not only should you not seek revenge, Jesus says, you should actively pursue grace. He says, but I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. And that word used for resist is antistani, which usually carries with it military connotations. In the Greek Septuagint, which was the Greek Old Testament used in Jesus' day, this word was used 71 times, and 44 of those refer to armed resistance in battle. Liddell and Scott's Greek lexicon says that this word means to set against, especially in battle. So the way forward for Israel, Jesus is saying, is not violent resistance, but creative, non-violent resistance. A better translation of verse 39 might be, don't use violence to resist evil. And then after this initial summary statement, Jesus provides for us 4 different examples. He picks out 4 basic human rights: dignity, security, liberty, and property. He says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And it's important here that Jesus specifies which cheek we start with. Because how do you slap someone on the right cheek? Now, I don't have any problem because I'm left-handed. I just rear back and I go. Left hand to right cheek. But in ancient times, being left-handed wasn't really seen as being a good thing to everybody, whether through nature or nurture, or by nurture I mean force, was forced to be right-handed. So if you're going to slap somebody with your dominant hand, you have to backhand them. And there's a whole lot of social and cultural stuff going on in that. Because a backhanded slap is seen as disgraceful and degrading. Craig Keener, in his commentary on Matthew, notes that a backhanded blow to the right cheek was, quote, the severest public affront to a person's dignity. So this slap isn't so much about bringing them pain or violence, but it's about degrading the individual, about not treating them as an equal. The slap is an attack on human worth and dignity. And Jesus calls us to lay aside our rights, to accept that loss of dignity, and to turn to them our left cheek as well. And we do that because the oppressor is not the person who gives us our dignity in the first place. It's no big loss to lose dignity in the eyes of the systems of empire. But rather, in the kingdom community, it's retaliation of violence with violence that leads to loss of dignity. So Jesus says, don't retaliate, turn the other cheek. And you turn the other cheek not as a way of being passive, not as a way of giving in to violence, but as a way of making your oppressor confront you, to make them think about their actions, to make them do it openly and publicly. So you respond to violence with non-violence, and that's what creates change. You refuse to give any potential for any sort of justification of violence. Non-violent resistance is what changes both oppressors and the society that surrounds them. And then second is the concept of security. As for the one who wants to sue you and take away your shirt, let him have your coat as well. And the shirt in question here is the inner garment. The coat is the outer garment. You know, you would have a few different inner garments, even as a poor person, but you would likely, if you were poor, only have one outer garment. And the setting for this is the typical first century debtor's court. And in Jesus' example and his story, a poor person is being taken to court for an unpaid debt. And they have literally nothing to repay except for the clothes on their back. It's the only collateral they can offer, the only thing of monetary value that they have. And I should note that they probably didn't get into this debt based on their bad financial decisions. Instead, their debt was the result of a system of inequality. They, even as they do today, in ancient times, the rich preyed on the poor in order to enhance their own wealth. When the poor couldn't bear the financial burden of oppression, the rich were right there to buy their property and then hire them to live and work the land. This is how we led to the concept of feudalism. This led to a system where the rich could and did easily exploit the poor. And they levy taxes and costs that could not be paid, and then they sue them and they take what little that they did have left. If you're sued for your inner cloak, Jesus says, go ahead, give him the outer one too. And it's interesting that when they're suing, that they're suing for the inner cloak. That's the one that the oppressor's after. And the reason for that is that Jewish law foresaw this, and it explicitly forbade making a man part with his outer cloak. In Exodus chapter 22, it says, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak as collateral, return it to him before sunset. For it is his only covering. It is the clothing for his body. What will he sleep in? And if he cries out to me, I will listen because I am gracious. So this becomes an important act of protest. That literally Jesus is saying, strip naked. They want it all, let them have it. Show them in vivid and graphic terms their injustice and their offense. Prove to them the cruelty of this oppressive system they're a part of that demands the poor give up necessities to feed the luxuries of the rich. See, rather than advocate passivity, Jesus moves into this dramatic, nonviolent protest that highlights exploitation and injustice and calls it to account. And third, you have the idea of liberty. It says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. The anyone that Jesus has in mind is a Roman soldier, because Rome had this law saying that any non-citizen could be forced to carry the burden of a Roman soldier for up to 1 mile. This is the exact terminology that is used when Simon of Cyrene carries the cross of Christ. So as a Jewish person, you would be forced to aid and abet the enemy. literally carry their weapons of war for them. The same tools that killed your people, you must now assist in carrying. And it truly represented for the Jewish person their complete lack of freedom within the Roman system. And Jesus says to go beyond that, to go a second mile. And you do that for the same reason that you go beyond in giving your outer cloak and then turning the other cheek. Because in doing this, you expose evil for what it is. When you turn the other cheek, you reclaim your dignity. When you offer up your cloak, you expose the evil system of inequality. And when you offer to go a second mile, you reclaim your freedom. You're choosing to do this. It's your free choice. And now you are in control. So imagine the Roman soldier that knows the law. They know they can conscript any non-citizen into their service for 1 mile. And they know that the limit is 1 mile. That it is not legal for a soldier to force an individual to carry their things beyond 1 mile. So what happens when that second mile begins? In Engaging the Powers, Walter Wink, a former professor of biblical interpretation at Auburn Theological, writes, imagine the situation of a Roman infantryman pleading with a Jew to give him back his pack. The humor of the scene may have escaped us, but it would scarcely have been lost on Jesus' hearers, who must have been regaled at the prospect of thus discomfiting their oppressors. At the end of 1 mile, who has power? This act of nonviolent protest, this act of love and service, turns the worldly system of powers on its head. Now the powerless have become powerful. And through their actions, they expose the injustice and the oppression of the system. They prove the corruption and sinfulness of the world and its kingdoms. And then lastly, we have an example about property. Jesus says, give to the one who asks you and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Compared to the last illustration, this one's relatively benign. It's just give freely. Give freely. Respond in love to economic needs. Hold on to your property loosely, knowing that you are stewards of it, that it is not yours but God's, that it's been given to you, your time, your talent, your resources. And this sort of radical call to action is what makes most people think that the Sermon on the Mount is naive and impractical. Is it naive? Not at all, because Jesus tells us exactly what we're getting into. Now, is it impractical? Of course it is, by the standards of this world. By doing what the oppressor requires, the disciples bear witness to the alternative reality of the kingdom of God. See, like all the laws before, Jesus moves the law from the old covenant to the new. He teaches us to be part of a radical new kingdom with this Sermon on the Mount as its constitution. He calls us to be a people who fight injustice with nonviolence, whose kingdom is not of this world, and yet whose influence extends throughout it.